bioaccumulation and effects of contaminants on animal and health populations. So his research program focuses on the demography of breeding birds, particularly waterfowl and waterbirds. And so Josh and his team have been studying the effects of habitat change on particularly avocets, stilts, and terns for the South Bay Salt Pond Restoration Project for over the last 20 years. So he's here today. He's going to share the results of that work, including some work on the most recent 2024 surveys. So Josh always serves up a really great presentation, and he's got some great slides for you today with not only some pictures, but some sound, I think. So thanks for being here today, Josh, and I'll let you take it away.
Okay, great. Really appreciate being asked to speak with you all today, and thanks, Donna, for the introduction. I am a research wildlife biologist with the USGS, and Donna discussed my expertise being in waterbird ecology and wetland management and restoration. And today I'd like to give an overview of our research on breeding waterbird ecology in management for the South Bay Salt Pond Restoration Project. And I'd like to first start by acknowledging my co-authors, Alex Hartman and Mark Herzog, who are here in my lab and have been really integral in producing the science that we're going to share with you all today. Okay, so an overview of the talk today, I'll be discussing nesting waterbird population trends and their habitat requirements, predatory gull population trends and impacts on other nesting waterbirds, and also some additional threats to breeding populations due to mercury pollution. And then we'll talk about potential solutions to these threats, including a recipe for the construction and management of islands based on the nesting preferences of waterbirds, ways to establish new waterbird nesting colonies using social attraction techniques, and also the potential future distributions of nesting waterbird populations in the South San Francisco Bay as the restoration project proceeds with future phases. So let's begin with waterbird population trends. We've been monitoring nesting populations for about 20 years in the South San Francisco Bay, and we've monitored nearly 30,000 nests over this time period. We conduct nesting surveys, or we have conducted nesting surveys annually from 2005 through 2019. And then more recently, since 2019, we've been surveying breeding colonies every 2 to 3 years. These are some pictures of our standard nest monitoring procedures, including searching for nests, primarily on islands within managed ponds. We also float eggs in water to age them in order to determine their incubation stage. A fresh egg will lay flat on the bottom of a cup of water, and then it will slowly rise up as it ages due to the change in density. We also measure nest site characteristics such as vegetation types and height. And we conduct weekly nest monitoring to determine egg hatching success, nest survival, nest densities, predation rates, and other factors. And when we have enough field staff, we also mark and recapture chicks with small leg bands in order to determine individual chicks' growth rates and also their survival rates from hatching to fledging. So this is a map of the cumulative distribution of nesting waterbirds in the South Bay for the past 20 years. And this research is in close collaboration with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service at the Don Edwards San Francisco Bay National Wildlife Refuge, which is shown in red, the prominent area here in red, and also the California Department of Fish and Wildlife's property at Eden Landing Ecological Reserve, shown up there in green. And then we have the South Bay Salt Pond Restoration Project area shown with white hatching on both of these properties. And yellow circles indicate both the location and the size of these waterbird nesting colonies throughout the South Bay over the last 20 years. So these graphs show the number of nesting colonies for the three main breeding waterbird species. At the top in orange, we have American avocets, black-necked stilts in black, and then Forrester's terns in purple. And for each of these primary nesting species in the bay, the number of colonies in the South Bay has declined over the past 2 decades. And currently, there are about 5 major colonies remaining for avocets. We have 3 remaining for stilts, and we also have 3 remaining colonies for foresters' terns. So now at the bottom, we're going to look at the total population size for all of these colonies combined. So we start here with the baseline target population size for American avocets, which was set by the Restoration Project goals. And now we can overlay the avocet population trajectory over the past 2 decades. And you can see that we're below the population target, as well as the avocet population has been declining over the last 2 decades. Black here is black-necked stilts, and there's the population target. And we've also seen that the black-necked stilt population has been declining over the last 2 decades and is below the target level. Now in purple here, here's the baseline target for foresters' terns. And now the population trend for foresters' terns. And foresters' terns populations had declined during 2017, 18, and 19, but recently we've had a very large increase in the foresters' tern population in 2022 and 2024. So overall, there is cause for concern for some breeding populations, but also some success stories, particularly with terns. So not only are there fewer breeding birds overall, but they are nesting in fewer places, like we've discussed, and the total number of colonies has been decreasing over the past couple decades. So we're looking at a series of maps here over the years, with the last survey we did in 2024 being the bottom right graph. And you can see the remaining colony sizes and locations in yellow on this map. The largest remaining colonies are at Pond A16 and Pond SF2, and there are a few smaller colonies remaining within the Moffett complex, and then also Eden Landing Ecological Reserve. So the data I showed you was based on our weekly nest monitoring data, and this method gives the most accurate assessment of the local breeding population size, as well as gives us the ability to do productivity estimates in terms of estimating a catching success, nest survival, and many other breeding demographics. But it may miss a few of the smaller breeding colonies that are scattered throughout the South Bay. Therefore, to confirm this overall population decline, we collaborated with several of our partners in the area to conduct a simultaneous bay-wide survey in 2019, which repeated the methods of a survey conducted by Point Blue Conservation Science in 2001. So we have found that the total population of avocets had declined by 14% between 2001 in red and 2019 in yellow. And also the black-necked stilt population declined by 30% between those years. We also looked at those birds that exhibited actual breeding behaviors, here for avocets and here for stilts. And we also found that the birds exhibiting breeding behaviors also declined by over 50% for both avocets and stilts. So together, these separate data sets using different survey methods really indicated that avocets and stilt populations have substantially declined over the past 2 decades. So we also use this survey data to examine bird use of specific habitat types. So I'll show you a series of maps. The first is American avocets, and each tiny little yellow dot is the location of an individual avocet. So we have an inset map here. And then we're looking at how avocets are using the habitats throughout the bay. So positive values above 0 mean that the habitat was used in greater proportion to its availability, whereas negative values below 0 indicate that the habitat was used less than it was available. So overall, we found that avocets here in red selected managed pond habitats and to a lesser extent, non-tidal marsh habitats, and avoided salt ponds, tidal marsh, and tidal mudflat habitats. Now we can look at the same habitat selection for stilts, this time in blue. And again, we see that stilts selected managed pond habitats and to a much greater extent, non-tidal marsh, such as New Chicago Marsh, for those of you familiar with the Alviso area. And just like avocets, they avoided salt ponds, tidal marsh, and tidal mudflat habitats. And then finally, in yellow, we're looking at foresters' terns, and they also selected managed pond habitats to a much greater extent, used non-tidal vegetated marsh essentially in proportion to its availability, and then avoided salt ponds, tidal marsh, and tidal mudflat habitats, just like the avocets and stilts did. So we really learned that managed pond habitat remains critically important for these breeding birds for both nesting and foraging. So as part of the South Bay Salt Pond Restoration Project's Phase 1 assessment, which was published in 2018 by the lead scientists, the project management team concluded that the project was not meeting expectations quite yet for waterbird nesting populations, indicated here with this red stoplight in their publication. And so these declining breeding populations still remain a concern as the project moves forward. So now let's move on to gull populations and their impacts on breeding birds. So another challenging issue facing the restoration project is the rapidly expanding population of breeding California gulls. And here we see a rapid increase in the population size of California gulls that are breeding within the South Bay. And these data come from the San Francisco Bay Bird Observatory. Now, we've overlaid this gull population trend on our data for foresters' terns in purple, and American avocets in orange, and in black here, black-necked stilts. So what we find is in the last 2 decades, the gull breeding population has increased by about 36%, whereas the avocet population has declined by 76%, and the stilt population has declined by 62%. Now, foresters' terns populations have been highly variable over the years, but they have actually increased from historically low levels in 2017 through 2019. So now, unfortunately, gulls are voracious predators of both the eggs and the chicks of other nesting waterbirds, particularly these 3 waterbird species. And they also exclude other breeding birds like terns and avocets from their preferred nesting sites. So they kind of have a double whammy impact on other breeding birds. So we've conducted several studies on the impacts of gulls on other breeding birds, including telemetry studies to track the gull use of the landscape and also their large dependence on landfills for foraging. So these data were collected during 2007 and 2008 when 60% of the California gulls nested within pond A6. And the other breeding colonies are at Maury, the other Maury site, and also Coyote Hills colony. So these gull data were collected in 2007 and 2008, and each data point here indicates the individual location of a gull during the various years and the various time periods that we were studying them. So the main thing to notice is that gulls are not only using their breeding colonies, as you might suspect, but they're also primarily using the 2 landfills in the area as foraging habitat, particularly the Newby Island landfill. So these landfills really dictate gull movements throughout the South Bay. So we used automated data logging systems that were placed at landfills and also at the primary gull colonies. And we were able to track the gull's timing of arrival and departure from both the colonies and the landfills. So here on the left, we have the percent of time that gulls were detected at the Newby Island landfill, which is the main landfill, and then also at the A6 breeding colony, which was the main breeding colony at the time. So we found that gulls arrived at the landfill in the morning when garbage was delivered, and gulls left at dusk when the landfills were closed and the garbage was essentially covered with dirt. So in contrast, gulls remained at the breeding colonies at night, and during the day, they left the breeding colony to go forage at the landfills. So these anthropogenic food resources at dumps really have a large influence on gull space movements and use of the South Bay landscape, and also have contributed to the rapid population growth of gulls. So we've conducted gull diet studies using stable isotope analysis, which can effectively separate the diet derived from human sources at landfills versus more naturally derived prey items from the estuary in various salt pond complexes down here. And as you might suspect, we found that landfills make up the majority, or garbage makes up the majority of their diets. But we've also found that avocet and tern eggs and chicks make up a detectable and important part of the gull's diet. And it's noteworthy that individual gulls are known for specializing on particular prey items. And from our radio tracking studies of Forster's tern and avocet chicks, we found that a single individual gull killed at least 11 tern chicks, because we found 11 individual leg bands in the same gull's nest that we had affixed to tern chicks at after they hatched in different areas than where the bands were recovered. So those gulls were bringing them back to the gull breeding colonies where they dropped the bands at their nest sites. So we've looked at the direct impacts of gulls on nesting waterbirds using nest cameras and also radio telemetry tracking of these recently hatched chicks. And we've documented that gulls depredate 11% of the eggs that are laid and are responsible for over 50% of the avocet and tern chick deaths, and a smaller percentage of the stilt chick deaths. And if you look closely in this photo, you can see that a gull is carrying away an avocet chick, and the avocet parents are in hot pursuit here. So one example of the direct impact that gulls can have on nesting waterbirds was observed during the restoration project's tidal marsh restoration at pond A6. And during 2010 and 2011, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and the restoration project essentially relocated the largest California gull colony in the bay by tidally flooding pond A6, which was previous to this a dry salt pond bed. So during this tidal restoration process, they essentially evicted 24,000 gulls that had been nesting here for the past several decades. And so we monitored the response to this large management action, and we documented that tern chick fledging success increased in the adjacent pond at A7 by over 900%. Now, in contrast, there was no change in tern chick survival at a reference colony that was located further away from the gull colony over in Moffett at pond A2W. So this result was focused on a single adjacent tern colony here at pond A7, but we've also looked at this for all the tern colonies in the South Bay. And that's what this is showing here. We have found that tern chick fledging success on the y-axis was negatively correlated with the number of gulls at the nearest gull colony, and also another gull predation pressure index, which incorporated all of the gull colony sizes and their distance to the focal tern colony. So both the gull colony size and its distance to the focal tern colony influenced tern chick fledging success. And so these results demonstrate really the large impact that gulls are having on other breeding birds in the bay, and the large management challenge that they pose for the restoration project. So potential solutions to the gull problem include hazing gulls at nesting sites and landfills. And here are some of San Francisco Bay Bird Observatory's data showing that their hazing activities at the primarily Newby Island landfill can effectively reduce gull occurrence at local landfills. However, when we conducted a small pilot study to see where these haze gulls were going instead of the Newby Island landfill down here, we found that gulls just simply traveled to further landfills, including all the way to the Central Valley, that were up to 64 kilometers away from their nesting sites. So this was a small pilot study, and further opportunities exist to learn about the potential for hazing gulls from preferred nesting sites in order to reduce their impacts on nesting waterbirds. So another threat to birds and to the success of the restoration project is a common pollutant in the bay, which is methylmercury poisoning. So mercury is a widespread and global pollutant and has serious effects on both wildlife and human health. And in California, we have widespread mercury pollution due to the historic mining of mercury in the Coast Range, shown here with the red dots. And then this mercury was brought up into the Sierra Nevada mountains, where they were used during the gold extraction process, and shown here in yellow. So consequently, elemental and inorganic forms of mercury are really widespread throughout our watersheds. Because methylmercury is so highly toxic to humans and wildlife, several global efforts seek to monitor and reduce mercury pollution, including the Minamata Convention on Mercury, which is a global treaty signed by over 140 nations to protect human health and the environment. And currently, the Minamata Convention on Mercury is conducting an effectiveness evaluation, which we are helping to complete over the next few years. Now, locally, mercury pollution is a real issue because the San Francisco Bay and Delta are considered to be hotspots within Western North America because birds have very high mercury concentrations in this area. Now, wetland management actions can really alter methylmercury cycling and can influence mercury concentrations in animals. Therefore, we have been periodically monitoring mercury concentrations in birds in the bay. So I run a mercury lab at USGS where we test mercury concentrations in animal tissues, including in birds, of course, and also fish and marine and terrestrial mammals. And methylmercury has numerous effects on wildlife and humans, but reproduction is really among the most commonly observed toxicity endpoints, especially for wildlife. And so we often study the effects of mercury on nesting birds. And we have found that mercury concentrations in Forster's tern eggs that fail to hatch have 28% higher mercury concentrations than randomly sampled and still viable tern eggs. We know that methylmercury is a neurotoxicant and can really affect bird nesting behaviors. And we have also found that parents with higher mercury concentrations will reduce their nest attentiveness and also even abandon their eggs in their reproduction attempt. So recently, we were asked by the Department of Interior's Office of Restoration and Damage Assessment to develop new toxicity benchmarks for injury assessments. And for that effort, we conducted a global literature review, extracted all the available published data, and then conducted modeling to determine the effects of methylmercury on bird health. And as part of that effort, we also developed a tool for natural resource damage assessment practitioners to actually estimate the injury to birds based on mercury concentrations in various bird tissues. And we call this the bird mercury tool. So first of all, our global meta-analysis confirmed that bird egg survival does indeed decline with increasing mercury concentrations in eggs. And as an example of this, we can use the bird mercury tool to estimate the injury to Forster's terns in San Francisco Bay, because Forster's terns are known to have very high mercury concentrations within the San Francisco Bay. And their average egg mercury concentration is 1.3 micrograms per gram of mercury on a fresh wet weight basis. So using the bird mercury tool in the various modeling that we've done, we estimate 11% injury to the breeding tern population, or in other words, that 11% of the tern egg population may die due to the current mercury, methylmercury contamination levels within the bay. So now that we've discussed some potential problems and management challenges for the restoration project, let's discuss some potential solutions. And specifically, let's start with the construction and management of islands as nesting habitat. So islands within managed pond habitats are really important for nesting waterbirds. Overall, 94% of Forster's terns, 74% of avocets, and about a quarter of the black-necked stilts within the South Bay nest on islands within these managed ponds. So this is a map of the restoration project showing some of the tidally restored salt ponds to date, and also some of the enhancements done to the managed ponds to mitigate for the loss of bird habitat due to tidal marsh restoration. And importantly, this included the construction of 30 new nesting islands, shown here in pond SF2, and also the construction of 16 new nesting islands in pond A16. You can see from these aerial images that about half the islands were constructed as round islands, and the other half were constructed as more linear islands. And we didn't know which type of island habitat might be best for nesting birds. So the restoration project wanted to test the types of islands constructed at Pond A16 and SF2 and understand how to build new nesting islands for future phases of the restoration project. So we conducted a study on the preferred nesting sites of waterbirds. And specifically, we asked how many islands should be put in a wetland, where should the islands be located within the wetland, what should be the size and shape of the island, and then what type of topography should be built on the island's surface. So to conduct this study, we used a very precise GPS system that had 1 centimeter accuracy called real-time kinetics. And we precisely measured the topography of 30 islands and also the locations of about 1,600 waterbird nests on those specific islands. And from these data, we were able to calculate digital elevation models of each of these islands. And we also calculated nest densities, nest success, and productivity in relation to habitat island features. So to begin to determine the number of nests within a pond and the number of, we looked at the number of nests in a pond in relation to the number of islands in the pond. And we found that the number of nests in each pond actually declined with the number of islands within the pond. So this indicated that we should construct fewer islands in more ponds as opposed to many islands in just a few ponds. Nest success increased with the distance that islands were located away from pond levees. And so this indicated that we should construct islands farther from levees. The number of nests on each island increased with an island shape index, such that more nests were found on linear islands, like the historical dredge spoil islands in Pond A16, compared to the round islands that were recently constructed in Pond SF2. So this indicated that we should construct these long and skinny sort of islands. Now, we also looked at island topography, which was a bit more complicated. So to do this, we collected a series of GPS point data to create digital elevation models for each of the islands. And then we estimated each island's topography, including its slope and its aspect, which is the direction that a small patch of the island faces. And we finally monitored the actual locations and survival rates of waterbird nests on each of these islands. And then we built a series of predictive models about the probability of a bird nesting in relation to several island habitat attributes, including the preferred distance to water that birds nest at, the preferred elevation that birds are nesting above the water level, the direction that the nest faces, and also the preferred slope for nesting on. So we then synthesized this information into a recipe for constructing new island nesting habitat for future phases of the restoration project. And this included where islands should be built, how many islands should be built in each wetland, how big and what shape islands should be, the island's topography, including its elevation, the preferred distance to water, the slope, the island's orientation, and also the type of vegetation that is preferred by nesting birds, which was determined to be short and dense vegetation with some patches of bare ground. So this recipe is being considered during phase 2 implementation of the restoration project. So in addition to the importance of providing island habitat for nesting, habitat for chick rearing is also very important. And we can see this by looking at chick movements in relation to their survival rates. So chick survival to fledgling for stilts is 40%, which is much higher than avocets, which is only 6%. And this difference occurs predominantly in young chicks, shown here in yellow, where daily survival is much lower in avocets, shown in red, than it is for stilts, shown in blue. So what's happening to these young chicks causing all these avocets to die? Well, as I mentioned earlier, gulls are responsible, are the primary predator for chicks of these birds and are responsible for 55% of avocets, but only 15% of the stilt chick deaths. Now, in turn, habitat drives these different predation rates because avocets primarily nest on islands, such as in pond A16, whereas stilts mainly nest within marshes that are vegetated, such as New Chicago Marsh. So these maps show the movements of chicks within the first week after hatching. So for avocet chicks in pond A16, where there's no vegetation, they immediately move south into New Chicago Marsh in order to get that protection from the vegetated marsh habitat. Now, in contrast, the avocets and the stilts that hatch in New Chicago Marsh just stay within this vegetated marsh and really don't have any directional movement patterns, and they don't leave the wetland because this vegetated marsh habitat really provides good protection from these aerial predators. In those avocet chicks that don't move south into New Chicago Marsh and they just stay in pond A16, they have very low survival rates and are eaten almost immediately by California gulls. So because of this complex interaction between nest site selection, habitat use, gull predation, and also chick survival, ultimately stilts fledged 3.3 times more chicks than avocets, even though avocets produced 1.8 times more nests than stilts. So habitat availability in nearby wetlands and ultimately the habitat mosaic within the restoration project at the landscape scale can really have a substantial population level impact through these cascading interactions with predators. Okay, so how can we reestablish nesting colonies and increase bird populations within these enhanced ponds? We helped the Don Edwards San Francisco Bay National Wildlife Refuge and the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers establish new bird breeding colonies in some of the newly enhanced ponds where islands were recently constructed for nesting habitat. So to do so, we placed decoys, such as this shown here, and also played breeding bird calls on islands as a means of social attraction techniques for colonial nesting species like terns. And this project was an effort not only to provide wildlife habitat on the refuge, but also to relocate some of the Caspian terns that were nesting in the Columbia River Basin in Oregon and Washington, where they were consuming large numbers of endangered salmonids. And so they needed a solution for that. And as I mentioned, we played Caspian tern colony sounds. And so I'll play you a snippet of what a breeding colony sounds like. And these were the sounds that were used to help establish these breeding colonies. So we did this project at the newly constructed islands at Pond SF2 and also at Pond A16. And the 5 red islands that we're showing here were the sites where we employed these social attraction techniques. So in just 3 years, we were able to establish 2 of the 3 largest Caspian tern colonies that now exist in San Francisco Bay. And so I'm going to show you a series of graphs with the numbers of birds that came in and started using these islands. So yellow here shows the number of adults using the islands over these 3 consecutive breeding seasons where we used social attraction techniques. And orange here are the number of nests that were laid. Blue is the number of chicks that successfully hatched on these islands. Green is the number of chicks that successfully fledged from the islands who were able to fly away. And prior to 2014, there were no Caspian terns that nested in these 2 ponds. But by the 3rd year of our social attraction efforts, we had over 500 nests laid and over 330 chicks that hatched on these islands where social attraction was employed. Now, we also use social attraction techniques to bring back some of the Forster's terns that had historically nested at Pond A16. And this graph shows Forster's tern nest abundance in Pond A16 in yellow relative to the total number of Forster's terns nesting in the entire South Bay, shown in red. So historically, there were a couple of hundred Forster's terns that nested within Pond A16. But then they built an additional 16 nesting islands within the pond. And after construction here in 2012 and into 2013, Forster's terns stopped nesting. And so with Valley Water's support, we use social attraction techniques during 2017 and also again in 2019 to try to build back this populations. Now, birds are philopatric to nesting sites, which means they come back and nest in areas where they have successfully nested in the past. So these social attraction techniques often take multiple years in order to establish a tradition of nesting at a particular site. So by the 2nd year of our social attraction technique studies, Forster's terns nested for the first time in 8 years. And then you can see that the Forster's tern population has increased dramatically after this initial seeding of the colony site. And in fact, in 2024, the Forster's tern colony increased so much in Pond A16 that it now accounts for roughly half of the entire nesting population of Forster's terns in the entire San Francisco Bay. So it was quite successful. Now, to wrap up here, let's consider the potential future distributions of nesting waterbird populations in the South San Francisco Bay. So before the South Bay Salt Pond Restoration Project began prior to 2005, about 34% of the South San Francisco Bay habitat was tidal marsh, 24% as salt ponds, 15% were managed ponds that contained islands suitable for nesting, and 17% were managed without ponds. 17% were managed ponds without islands. Now, by 2050, it's expected that most of the managed ponds will be converted to tidal marsh, with just 6% of the habitat in managed ponds that have islands, 5% as managed ponds without islands, and then the majority, 55% of the landscape, will be in tidal marsh habitat. However, the restoration project is also building new nesting islands to attempt to compensate for this habitat loss. And so the number of islands within the remaining managed ponds are expected to increase and could play a key role in maintaining breeding waterbird populations. And as an example of this, in 2024, our nest monitoring surveys indicated that 94% of Forster's terns, 52% of avocets, and 47% of black-necked stilts in the entire South Bay nested within ponds A16 and ponds SF2, which, as we've discussed, have recently been enhanced with many new nesting islands for these species. So this is great news in the sense that it shows the importance and effectiveness of managed pond habitats, but also a little concerning that so many birds are nesting in such few ponds now. But by strategically placing new nesting islands and managed pond habitats throughout the restoration project area, future phases of the restoration project might be able to maintain or even grow the local population of nesting waterbirds and provide increased opportunities for viewing birds. So as part of this adaptive management process, we hope to be able to provide the restoration project with an assessment of what waterbird populations might look like after future phases of the project are completed. And one approach to do so could be to conduct a landscape scenario planning exercise where you could use past bird data to predict which managed ponds might be best to restore to tidal marsh, which managed ponds might be best to retain as managed ponds, and which managed ponds might be best to enhance with new nesting islands, social attraction techniques, and gull control measures such as hazing. So in this slide, we have 3 maps showing the habitat that existed before the restoration project started in 2005, current habitat in 2024, and the likely potential future scenario in 2050. So dark blue areas are managed ponds, managed pond habitats, and they will be enhanced with, some of these will be enhanced with new nesting islands, and those are shown with neon blue. And so we also see the restoration project tidal marsh areas in green, and a much larger percentage of the habitats turning into this green tidal marsh habitat. Now, importantly, some of these managed ponds will be enhanced with islands, such as some of the plans for the Moffat area, turning these ponds from managed ponds into and enhanced ponds with new nesting islands. And some of our future modeling predicts increased populations of, in this case, avocets due to this increase in islands within the Moffat Salt Pond Complex. And our preliminary estimates are that it is potential, there has potential to be an increase in avocet populations in the future. So overall, our preliminary prediction shows the potential for these increased populations with the addition of these nesting islands. So to conclude, populations of breeding shorebirds in San Francisco Bay are declining, with more positive trends for Forster's terns and Caspian terns after substantial island construction activities and social attraction methods were employed to reestablish these breeding colonies. And we know that waterbirds prefer to nest on islands within managed ponds because they confer much higher nest survival. And the restoration project has been successful at building new nesting islands, particularly in ponds SF2 and pond A16. And we've been able to use the nest monitoring data to determine the island characteristics that are preferred by nesting birds. So this recipe for new island construction and management can be used in future phases of the restoration project. And additionally, our use of social attraction techniques has been widely successful at establishing the second and third largest colonies of Caspian terns in the bay, as well as reestablishing the largest breeding population of forest terns in the South Bay at pond A16. But challenges do still remain, including the ever-expanding population of breeding Californian gulls, which remain voracious predators of other waterbird eggs and chicks, and also waterbird exposure to toxic methylmercury contamination, which is produced within these wetland habitats, is also likely causing substantial impairment to waterbird reproduction. Future additions of new nesting islands that are strategically placed in the remaining managed pond habitats might be able to maintain or even increase waterbird breeding populations, such as the successful efforts at pond Sept and pond A16. And additional efforts using social attraction methods to establish new nesting colonies on these newly constructed islands in future phases of the project, as well as hazing gulls away from preferred nesting sites, might be required to support the preferred populations of breeding waterbirds in the South San Francisco Bay. So with that, I'd like to end by thanking all of the partners and the funders for their project support and collaboration over the past 2 decades, and also to thank the project management team over the years for all their input and support. So thank you very much. And now I think we have some time for questions.
Yeah, thanks so much, Josh. Fantastic data-rich presentation. Really great. Yeah, we did have some questions, and I'm sure there'll be many, but I'll start with Carlton had one early on. For avocets in particular, can the percent of individuals breeding in a given population vary greatly from year to year across sites? And what factors are most at play with that variability?
That's a great question. Definitely breeding propensity, which is the proportion of birds in the populations that are actually breeding, can vary. We don't particularly know why this might be for the species we're studying, and we're not sure what could be causing it in the bay, but other studies have indicated that foraging opportunities and the availability of food resources could play a large role, in addition to just simple opportunities for nesting, locations for nesting that are free from predation, intensely predator-rich environments, and a lot of predation pressure can cause them to abandon nesting attempts.
Great, thanks. Rick has a question. Have you looked at population trends for non-native red foxes and possible impacts on shorebirds?
I have not looked at red fox population trajectories. There is active aphis control of foxes and ravens and some gulls in a few sites throughout the South Bay. And I know they have pretty successful trapping efforts ongoing. And there has been a study published on the success of those efforts, particularly to control predators around breeding least tern colonies in the South Bay, showing how effective those approaches can be.
I'm just going to echo Carlton's comment. They said that he's got so many questions. Maybe he'll reach out to you separately. But he said
Okay, great.
We can't possibly answer them in one Zoom meeting. Rick also asked, what's the trend for mercury concentration in tern fish prey in South San Francisco Bay?
What's the trend for mercury concentrations in prey fish populations? So annual trends for mercury concentrations in fish have not been tested annually, other than the regional monitoring program, which has a couple of sites in the South Bay, but not really within the restoration ponds themselves. We have done several studies on mercury concentrations in prey fish and invertebrates in the ponds. We do see trends seasonally within the year. And unfortunately, we found that mercury concentrations in prey fish like silver sides and stickleback our primary prey fish, they actually increase and exhibit this inverse U-shaped pattern where the highest mercury concentrations in prey fish, unfortunately, are timed perfectly with the hatch of tern eggs. And so these young chicks are getting quite a slug, not only from their parents through the maternal transfer of mercury from the parents to offspring in the eggs, but then also through parents feeding young chicks these fish.
Great, thanks. Daniel asks, are depredation of gull adult chicken eggs being conducted? Are depredation of gull adult chicken eggs are being conducted or considered? Legal ramifications.
Okay, so I can interpret that two ways. One is just our gulls depredating the chicks and eggs of other waterbirds. They definitely are, but I think they're asking are gulls being removed from the population through culling activities? And yes, the refuge and APHIS has permits to do so. The effort, I think, right now is on individual gulls that are considered specifically problematic, but larger efforts that often occur, such as culling larger numbers of birds through oiling of eggs so that they can't hatch, or more widespread gull culling activities are not presently occurring in the bay. It's just individual case basis is my understanding from what APHIS is doing.
Matea asks, could you link the study conducted about predator management in the South Bay? And Carlton seconded that. So that's maybe something after this talk, or if Alex has a link for it. So
yes, yeah, we can link that.
John Calloway asks, are there any other approaches that might reduce gull predation, or are there other areas experiencing similar increased gull predation or nesting waterbirds?
So activities that the refuge maintains, and we try to help them with these efforts when we're in the field during nest monitoring surveys, is gull hazing activities. And you can haze gulls from the preferred nesting sites. And we help the refuge do this in order for the avocets, terns, and stilts to establish those early nesting colonies in the years and try to haze gulls away from those preferred nesting sites. So that is part of the management plan for the refuge that is currently being conducted.
I'm going to skip down to Jennifer's question. She asked about hazing, particularly about falconry abatement.
Yes, so my understanding is that that falconry was used at Newbie Island landfill to haze gulls away from the Newbie Island landfill. And that was that slide I was showing you where San Francisco Bay Bird Observatory was monitoring the effectiveness of that hazing, which included falconry. I don't know if it's currently ongoing still, but that was one of the techniques that was used to haze gulls away from the Newbie Island landfill. In that graph I showed you with gulls now traveling to other landfills at further distances.
So Dave wants a copy of the audio of the tern colony so he can use it for his ringtone.
Sure.
Yeah, and then Laura Cholodenko had a question. Let me see if I can find it again. Question about a shift in, I can't find it. Oh, there it is. It keeps not showing up. Did the gull population increase in San Francisco Bay after the gulls' loss of nesting habitat at Mono Lake? And could a return of habitat in Mono Lake shift gulls back to that habitat?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I don't think we have the answer to that, but it has been suspected that that was a contributing factor. In general, I think it was 1982, there was, just a couple hundred gulls nesting in the bay. And really the expansion of salt ponds, the availability of these levees as nesting habitat in really some of these dry salt pond beds really provided ample areas for nesting. And then with these local food sources at the landfills really provided kind of the perfect breeding opportunities. And it is true that mono lake habitat is being lost for nesting California gulls, which are native, and so it is suspected that part of the population could have moved to San Francisco Bay and really um, given it that jump start to increase the population here locally.
Great. So thanks for the link, Alex, for the predator removal study. It's in the chat if people are interested in it. I think we may have time for one more question. I just want to give you a shout out for the photo of the California gull with the chick with the parents chasing it. I love that photo. It's amazing.
Well, that was I can't remember if it was Ken Finices or Michael Kearns, but they've been great sharing their photos, and a lot of their photos appeared in this talk. So thanks to them. They're friends of the restoration project.
So one last question, because Carlton doesn't have enough time. We got to give him another opportunity here. To the issue of individual problem predators, this can also be the case with common raven depredation of chickens, which also warrants ongoing management. So
that's right. Yeah. And I believe that ravens are part of APHIS's predator control procedures when necessary.
Yeah, quickly, Jennifer says regarding egg oiling, she knows of one organization who's been using drones to oil raven eggs located in desert tortoise habitat. Wondering if there's a thought about attempting egg oiling again.
That's I'd have to let the refuge answer on that. They were in discussions with the permitting offices about that, but my understanding is there are no plans to proceed with that currently.
Well, we're right at time. I want to say thanks, Josh. Lots of good questions for you. Thanks so much for your talk and all the research. So we're looking forward. We're hoping that Josh and his team will be out in the marshes and in the ponds again next year. So we'll have more data coming in the future. So thanks again. Great talk.
Thank you so much, everyone.
Thanks everyone for being here.
Yeah.
Great talk, Josh.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. Have a good day.
Bye.